Welcome to a history lesson on the early years of Nazareth. First, a little ancient history. In the early 1400s, the group we now know as Moravians began in Bohemia and Moravia, which are now part of the Czech Republic. We began as a group called Hussites, following the martyrdom of a Catholic priest, Jan Hus. Hus's followers also were known as the Ancient Unity. In 1457, members of the Unity formed an organized church in Kunwald called the Unitas Fratrum, or United Brethren. They were led by Gregory the Patriarch and Luke of Prague. They suffered religious persecution, and in 1628, many were led by Bishop John Amos Comenius to Poland. Others scattered to Holland, England, Saxony, while some stayed and hid in Bohemia and Moravia. They buried their Bibles in their gardens, held midnight meetings in stables, hid their records in their thatched roofs, and waited. These believers, who worshipped in secret, were known as the hidden seed. They believed that God would protect this seed, and one day it would grow into a tall, strong tree of faith. That tree of faith is our Moravian Church. In 1722, members of the Unitas Fratrum traveled to what is now Germany and established the town of Herrnhut, whose name means the Lord's Watch. They settled on land owned by a Lutheran noble who became their spiritual leader and benefactor, Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Together, the Count and the Moravians shared a zeal for mission, and the first two Moravian missionaries left Herrnhut for the island of St. Thomas in 1732. Moravian mission had begun, and within 3 years, Moravians sailed to America. There are 3 main reasons why the Moravian Brethren came to America. First, there was a real possibility that they would need a place of refuge if they were forced out of Europe. Second, the Church wanted to spread its message of peace and love to the Europeans immigrating to America. And third, they wanted to do mission work among the Native Americans. In April of 1735, a small group of Moravians sent from Germany and led by Augustus Gottlieb Spangenberg arrived in Georgia to form a settlement to minister to the Native Americans and European settlers there. But the Moravians faced problems because of their pacifism, as disputes between Spain and England raged. Malaria also took its toll, killing 10 of the 50 Moravians. Many of those who were left sailed back to Europe. With only 9 Moravians remaining, the Georgia settlement was abandoned. Led by the Reverend Peter Bowler, these remaining 9 Moravians sailed from Savannah to Philadelphia on a sloop owned by evangelist George Whitefield, arriving on April 25, 1740. Whitefield proposed that the Moravians assist him in building a school and orphanage for slave children, and the Moravians agreed to his proposal. And 5 days later, on April 30th of that year, Whitefield purchased a 5,000-acre tract of land in the forks of the Delaware from William Allen for 2,200 pounds sterling. Allen had acquired the land from Letitia Penn, daughter of William Penn, in 1735 for 500 pounds sterling and 1 red rose annually. The land Whitefield purchased was already called the Barony of the Rose. Barony because it held baronial court privileges, and Rose to acknowledge Letitia Penn's requirement that one red rose be presented to her annually. Whitefield retained the baronial rights, but he renamed the tract Nazareth. On May 6, 1740, two Moravian brethren, Reverend Peter Bowler and Anton Seifert, and a friend, Henry Antes, arrived in Nazareth to conduct a general survey of the tract. The three slept that first night under a nearby large black oak tree, a tree that was forever known as Bowler's Oak. The following morning, the three selected an appropriate site for Whitefield's school and orphanage, centrally located in the barony. By the way, that piece of oak is preserved in the Whitefield House Museum here in Nazareth. On May 28, 1740, 10 Moravians traveled from the Germantown area to Nazareth to settle the new area and begin work on the school. Living in the shelter of Bowler's Oak, they reported they could hear wolves howling as they sang in worship. But were the wolves singing along or howling in protest? For housing, they constructed a 2.5-story cabin that became the first house of Nazareth. In the early years, the first house was used as a kitchen and a home for the single sisters. This building was torn down in 1864, but a quick jump to the fall of 2014, 150 years after the first house was destroyed, archaeologists from Hunter Research uncovered the original foundation of the first house and some wonderful artifacts. Be sure to stop in the Whitefield House Museum to see them. By September of 1740, after a very rainy season, only the foundation of the large stone building had been completed. Realizing that not much more work on the building would happen before winter, a log cabin was built adjacent to the first house and finished in October. This 1.5-story structure is known as the Gray Cottage and is the oldest remaining Moravian structure in North America. In November of 1740, Bowler met with Whitefield to report on the progress on the school and orphanage. It is said that an argument ensued. A strict Calvinist, Whitefield challenged Bowler on the doctrine of predestination and was insulted by Bowler's defense of free will. Whitefield literally fired the Moravians from his building project and ordered them to vacate Nazareth. After a negotiation by land agent Nathaniel Irish, the Moravians were allowed to stay in Nazareth for the winter. Led by Reverend Bowler, the group held its first Christmas Eve vigil in the Gray Cottage, with corn cakes and a drink made from roasted rye, followed by Holy Communion. This was the first Moravian love feast in Pennsylvania. Over time, the gray cottage has served many purposes: a widow's house, a boys' school, worship space, and a home for retired missionaries. Needing to move from Nazareth, the Moravians now searched for suitable land in the area to settle. In February 1741, it was decided by lot that they would purchase 500 acres on the bank of the Lehigh River at the mouth of the Monocacy Creek. By late June, both log structures, as well as the stone foundation in Nazareth, were abandoned as the Moravians worked on constructing buildings in what would become the settlement of Bethlehem. In spring of 1741, George Whitfield's land agent died, leaving him financially compromised. Whitfield reluctantly sold the entire tract of the barony of Nazareth to the Moravians for £2,500 sterling. The deed was transferred to the group on July 18, 1741. After only 1 month of vacating Nazareth, the Moravians now owned the land, and plans were developed to complete the stone building and settle the tract. Bethlehem and Nazareth were to be sister settlements in one large Moravian community. Nazareth at this time was chosen to be the center of this community. And here is where my personal story in Nazareth begins. Led by Reverend Bowler, a seed congregation of 56 Moravians from Europe and England, known as the First Sea Congregation, sailed aboard the ship Catherine for North America. This group included my ancestors Michael and Johanna Meksch, who had married by lot in a group wedding in Herrenhag to populate the congregation. The ship arrived in Philadelphia on June 7, 1742. German-speaking settlers in the group were sent to Bethlehem. Small groups of the remaining English-speaking settlers traveled to Nazareth to occupy the 2 log structures and continue work on the tract. In October, these English-speaking Moravians moved to Philadelphia to form a congregation there. Nazareth was again abandoned, except for 3 caretaking couples, one of which was Michael and Johanna Meksch, my ancestors. They lived here in Nazareth alone for 3 months to oversee the tract and guard it from the natives. And yes, there were natives in and around Nazareth. According to entries in the Nazareth diaries, upon arrival in 1740, Bowler and the Moravians were surprised to find a large Lenape Native American settlement named Welagomika, just north of the area where the Moravian buildings were being built. The Moravians worked to teach the natives about God, and many of them became Christian, including their leader, Captain John. In 1742, after the Moravians owned the land, they reached an agreement with Captain John and paid him for the improvements that he and his people had made. The natives then moved from the tract. With Moravians in both Nazareth and Bethlehem, the church leaders in Germany now determined that Bethlehem would be the congregational settlement, and Nazareth, with its 5,000 acres, would become the center for agriculture to support both areas. In 1743, word from the Moravian leaders in Europe reached Pennsylvania that 6 farms on the barony of Nazareth were planned, and families suitable for farming would be sent to settle them. Masons and carpenters worked tirelessly to complete the big stone building to house these new arrivals. We now know that big stone building as the 1740 to 1743 Whitfield House. On January 2, 1744, 33 couples, the Second Sea Congregation, moved into the building. The Zoll on the first floor was dedicated as the first official house of worship in Nazareth. On July 18, 1743, the Gray Cottage saw some new activity as the Moravian Boys' School moved into it from Bethlehem. 10 pupils, led by a headmaster and his wife, remained there for 2 years. So the year 1743 marked the beginning of what would become Nazareth Hall, or Nazareth Hall Military Academy, which operated for 186 years until 1929. On January 18, 1744, the first death occurred in Nazareth. George Kremser died suddenly. A cemetery was chosen on the highest spot of the tract and was consecrated with his interment. 67 Moravians are buried there. Today, this first Moravian burial ground is known as the Ruhberg, meaning Hill of Rest, or more commonly called the Indian Cemetery. And yes, 4 Christian Indians, 2 women, and 2 children are buried there. But the cycle of life continued, and the first birth in Nazareth occurred in the Whitfield House on May 4, 1744. A baby boy, Johannes Schaub, was born. In May of 1745, 8 families moved into a newly built Familian house to settle the first of 6 planned farms known as Nazareth Plantation. Today, a private home on South Whitfield Street, known as Wayne Cottage, sits at an angle to the present-day street. It was part of the Nazareth Plantation and was the home of village mechanics. During French and Indian wartime, 1756, it may have been occupied by colonial soldiers, including Captain Isaac Wayne, the father of Revolutionary War soldier who was known as Mad Anthony Wayne. That is why this building is still known as Wayne Cottage. The second farming community, located about 1½ miles west of Old Nazareth, was begun with 6 families occupying a large house on December 2, 1745. This settlement was called Gnadenthal, or Dale of Grace. We know the area as Grace-Dale. This was a large plantation for married families who raised vegetables, livestock, and poultry to support the sisters and brothers in both Nazareth and Bethlehem. In 1747, the unmarried or single brethren settled another farm, Albrecht's Spring, 1,500 acres about 1/2 mile southwest of Gnadenthal. That third settlement was renamed Christiansbrunn, or Christian's Spring, in honor of Count Zinzendorf's son, Christian Renatus, who was the spiritual leader of single men in the worldwide church. That settlement was a living and working place for single brethren and the boys they trained in many trades, including blacksmithing, shoemaking, weaving, brewing, gunstock, and rifle making, with the famous Andreas Albrecht as the master. The brewery here at Christian Spring supplied beer to Bethlehem's Sun Inn, and the single brethren continued their communal living here until 1771. A new grist mill about 2 miles northwest of the Whitfield House tract, along the Bushkill Creek, was completed on August 21, 1750. A 4th new farm there was begun in the spring of 1751 and was named Friedenstall, or Vale of Peace. Friedenstall was also the site of the region's first printing press. For various reasons, two remaining farm communities were never realized. They were to be Gnadenstadt, or City of Grace, north of the Whitfield House tract, near the present-day village of Schenck, and Gnadenhohe, or Hill of Grace, west of Old Nazareth, along the hillside later occupied by Nazareth Hall. One of the most distinctive features of Moravian life in the 1700s was that members were organized, lived, and worshipped in groups known as choirs, according to their gender, age, and marital status. Living communally in choir houses, aristocrats and commoners alike lived, slept, ate, and worked together without regard for rank. That was unheard of in this time period. Under the direction of Bishop Augustus Gottlieb Spangenberg, in Nazareth, its settlements, and in Bethlehem, everyone worked for the common good, and they all received free housing, food, clothing, education, and medical care. This system allowed married couples to go out in mission to the natives. These were the Pilgergemeine, while others, the Hausgemeine, stayed and worked to support all. Besides agriculture, the communities had about 35 trades and industries, from a tannery to a goldsmith. From 1741 to 1762, the Moravians operated one of the most successful communes in American history. This was known as the general economy. In 1756, there were 1,132 Moravians who were part of this economy. By late spring of 1745, the original residents of the Whitfield House had moved to the various farming communities. Portions of the building soon became the new home of the Moravian boarding school for girls. In May, the Single Sisters Choir, who were the unmarried Moravian women, moved into the Gray Cottage and the first house to work as caregivers and teachers in the girls' school. The following year, on July 27, 1746, George Whitfield himself made his only visit to Nazareth. He inspected the school and nearby farming community and was pleased to see that his vision for a school had been realized. He was especially happy that Native American girls were being educated there as well. With the girls' school and Single Sisters moving to Bethlehem in November of 1748, the Whitfield House became the Moravians' nursery for Nazareth, the farming settlements, and Bethlehem. With ages ranging from 16 months to 5 years old, 56 children were moved into the Whitfield House on January 7, 1749. One endearing diary entry records the children singing hymns in 3 languages, English, German, and some in their Native American tongue. A communal nursery remained there, with one exception in 1755 until 1762. This nursery freed married couples to work in the settlements. They were known as the Hausgemeine, or to serve as missionary couples to the natives. They were called the Pilgergemeine. They could do this without concern for supporting their families or maintaining their households. In this time period, an English visitor who was given a small room in the Whitfield House remarked that a bell hung from an oak tree on the west side of the house. It was used to call the Moravians to worship. This was the original and first bell in Nazareth. In 1752, the first inn was constructed along the King's Highway, about 1 mile north of the Whitfield House. The Tavern Beyond Nazareth, as it was known, was later called the Rose Inn, and provided lodging and food for non-Moravian visitors to the area. Remember that Nazareth was a Moravians-only restricted community from its founding in 1740 until it opened to non-Moravians in 1856. Only Moravians lived and worked here. Non-Moravians could and did visit the community often, but they could not reside here. The Rose Inn contained 7 rooms, a kitchen, a cellar, with a stable and spring house added later. 2 of its most famous guests were the sons of William Penn, Richard and John. In 1756, during the French and Indian War, nearly 60 refugees found shelter at the inn, which had been enclosed in palisades. It also quartered many soldiers, with officers sleeping inside and their troops outside on the grounds. The farming settlements, including Nazareth and the Rose Inn, were known collectively as the Upper Places. In December 1755, with fear of Indian attacks during the French and Indian War, which had begun in 1754, the children in the nursery were moved from Nazareth to Bethlehem, which was better fortified. The Whitfield house then overflowed with refugees from the mountains and surrounding areas. These were people fearful of the Indian uprisings, and they sought safety in the sturdy stone building. A 10-foot-high stockade was built around the Whitfield house tract, as well as around Friedenstall, Christian's Spring, and the Rose Inn. Men were assigned guard duty and carried guns, but were told to only fire over the heads of any warring natives. The number of refugees in Nazareth and the Upper Places in 1756 was 358, while the Moravian population itself was only 187. By the way, we have lists of names of all the refugees staying in the settlements. You might find your own ancestors listed. Fearful of more deaths in the turmoil of 1756, a new God's Acre, as Moravian cemeteries are called, was planned by Bishop Spangenberg and dedicated below the original 1744 cemetery, closer to the settlement, making it more convenient to the village with less fear of Indian attack. A gate at the entrance there was inscribed in German, "Because I live, you will also live," on the east side, and on the west side, written in English, was, "The body rests in hope." This continues as our present cemetery for Moravians in Nazareth. These are images of the Whitfield house in the 1800s. In 1830, the building again reverted to a center for education when the Moravian Theological Seminary moved here, occupying the building for 8 years, then returning again in 1855. Over the years, the Whitfield house, sometimes referred to as the Stone House or the Ephrata House, has served as a communal residence, the first consecrated place of worship, a Moravian school for girls, the home of the Moravian Theological Seminary, a children's nursery for Nazareth and Bethlehem, a haven for refugees during the French and Indian War. It has also housed Moravian ministers in retirement as well as missionaries home on furlough. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the Whitfield House today is the home of the Moravian Historical Society and its museum. Formed in 1857 to preserve the contributions of the Moravian Church to American history and culture, it truly is one of Nazareth's treasures. In the 1750s, the Moravian spiritual leader and benefactor, Count Zinzendorf, expressed his intention to ultimately reside in Nazareth, which had baronial rights. The church began to plan and build a residence suitable for their leader. A cornerstone was laid on May 3rd, 1755, and on November 13th the following year, the manor house, with its first-floor zaal or chapel, was dedicated. Incidentally, this manor house was the largest single-family home in colonial America, larger than the governor's palace in Williamsburg. The count, however, died in Germany in 1760 at the age of 60. Rooms in the building became work and living areas for many Moravians, including David Tannenberg, the organ builder, and John Valentine Haidt, the famous Moravian artist. Tracing its roots to the Gray Cottage in 1743, in 1759 the Moravian Boys' School moved into the manor house, using it as dormitories and a chapel. Later, this whole area became known as Nazareth Hall. It began as a school to educate the sons of Moravian ministers and missionaries, and in 1785 became a very famous tuition-based boarding school for Moravians and non-Moravians alike. As a classical academy, it attracted boys from age 7 to 12 from all over the country and different parts of the world, including St. Croix and Jamaica. The school emphasized classical education as well as vocational training and religious instruction. In 1841, the famous Cherokee Indian chief John Ross visited the school and then sent his sons to Nazareth Hall. In 1862, military drill was begun to encourage discipline along with classroom learning. The students were now organized into a uniformed cadet company, now called Nazareth Hall Military Academy. Cadets were arranged by age into social and residential room companies, 5 companies with 10 to 20 boys per unit. In 1894, outdated military uniforms, or uniforms made by parents, became the dress code. Generals and soldiers fighting on both sides of the Civil War were graduates of Nazareth Hall. 234 former cadets fought for the Union, 26 for the South, with 262 Hall cadets fighting in that war. The school closed in 1929. The 1840 church, as it is known, was the third consecrated house of worship and first freestanding church building of the Nazareth Moravians. The sanctuary was located on the upper floor, with the congregation seated facing the side or widest wall, with a speaker's table under the windows. This was the style of the mother church in Herrnhut, Germany. By 1861, the congregation outgrew the building, and construction began on the present church on the circle. The former church building then became a lecture hall and gymnasium for the boys' school. It contained an indoor swimming pool, possibly the first indoor pool in the country. It's said that the cadets learned to swim quickly because the pool was fed by spring water, never reaching a temperature above 60 degrees. Adjacent to the 1840 church were connected buildings called the First Rooms. These buildings included the library, classrooms, and study rooms for the boys. 5 to 6 hours of instruction, with 2 1/4 hours at noon for a study period, occurred daily except for Sunday. Besides the basics of reading, writing, and many forms of math and arithmetic, courses included English, German, Latin, French, Greek, history, geography, music, and drawing. More subjects including bookkeeping, surveying, chemistry, and vocational areas like photography, telegraphy, and industrial drawing were added. In the early years, English was spoken 3 days a week, German 3 days a week, and both languages were spoken on Sundays. At the far end of the first rooms was the headmaster's house, also known as the president's house or the principal's house. Built between 1817 to 1822, besides living quarters for the headmaster and family, it contained a locker room and shower room for the boys. From 1941 to 1966, the house provided housing and care for orphaned children, operated by the Will Arbeitel Children's Home Incorporated. Across the grounds is the 1784 Single Sisters House for the unmarried women of the congregation. The sisters lived and worked here, assisting the hall boys as seamstresses, laundresses, and cooks. A dining hall for the cadets was in this building. The center grassy area in the hall quadrangle became the parade grounds for the cadets. The 35-foot stone cenotaph was unveiled in a ceremony on June 11, 1865, to honor Union cadets who had died fighting in the Civil War. 27 boys died fighting for the Union, and 5 died fighting for the South. In 1786, a small park was created west of the hall buildings, connecting at the top to God's Acre. The area was later known as the Pleasure Gardens, with trees and shrubs, terraces and a brook, and plantings brought back by Moravian missionaries from around the world. It was a place where the cadets could visit with their families, present plays and musical concerts, and enjoy boyhood activities like sledding. To complete the hall area, adjacent to the sisters' house was a laundry where sisters and cadets did their washing. Also in that area was an outhouse, said to be a 2-story outhouse, with the sisters using the top floor. Thank goodness for gravity. Below the sisters' house was the 1782 Schenck House, which had the youngest cadets living there who were known as the Fourth Room Company. Known as the Hall Boys, the cadets marched to church on Sundays and worshiped in the present Moravian sanctuary from the 1860s until the school closed in 1929. Besides education and military training, the cadets also enjoyed many sports: tennis, football, basketball, baseball, and they competed against local teams including many local high schools and colleges. Prior to 1771, this drawing shows the layout of Old Nazareth. In January 1771, Moravian surveyor George Golkowski laid out plans for an area known as New Nazareth, between the Whitfield House tract and the Manor House. This would be an area where Moravians could build and live in family homes and operate small businesses rather than living and working in communal buildings. This area is defined by Main Street running north and south, and Center Street running east and west. A large town square, now commonly known as the Circle, was created where the two streets intersected. Originally a shelter for the first fire engine, named the Good Intend, a marketplace where vendors could sell produce, and a water tank were located there. Now in New Nazareth, along East Center Street, was the home of David Moritz Michael, where the famous Moravian composer and teacher at the boys' school lived. Along the circle, close to East Center Street, was the 1772 first store for the Moravian congregation. It was operated by the village committee of the church. It is now stuccoed and houses law offices. On the opposite corner from the first store, also along East Center Street, Andrew Kern, a joiner and influential church leader, built a private home in 1820 for his family, which included 12 children. Like most homes and buildings in this time period, cooking and dining were all done in their whitewashed basements. Directly across the circle from the Kern house, along West Center Street, was the second store, designed in 1796 by William Henry II, a joiner and a famed gunsmith. The store was on the first floor, with families living above. And here is the oldest building in New Nazareth, a stone building built in 1771 as the home and hat manufacturing business of Jacob Christ. This became the first industry in the village of Nazareth. Christ became famous, and many visitors frequented his shop to buy his stovepipe beaver skin hats. The building in 1890 was changed to a Victorian-looking home with turrets and trim. Along West Center Street, behind the present-day Moravian church on the circle, in June of 1771, Peter Warbass from Bethlehem chose a spot of land and built the first private dwelling in Nazareth, moving in that December. A few buildings below that house, at the corner of Center and Green Streets, was the first parsonage built for the Moravian pastors and their families. Pictured here around the circle are the present-day Moravian church, built in 1861 as the fourth house of worship, and the Italianate parsonage built for the pastor in 1875. Along South Main Street, below the circle, are many Moravian buildings hidden behind the facades of modern businesses. Their basements continue to tell their early stories. Here are two. The 1773 Single Brethren's house, where the unmarried men of Nazareth lived and practiced some trades. The house had a zal for worship, rooms for sleeping and working. Part of the original building is now a floral shop. Below the brothers' house was the 1781 home and gun manufactory and shop of William Henry II, who made guns in Nazareth. In 1798, after receiving an order for 2,000 guns from Pennsylvania's governor, Henry applied to the church leaders for permission to enlarge his workshop and employ outsiders who were not Moravian as laborers. These requests were denied, and Henry moved his gun factory to the area outside of Nazareth known as Jacobsburg. Here are two other views of New Nazareth, as well as a map that includes the names of the owners of the homes in this area. With the growing area of New Nazareth, many more people were traveling through the town and frequenting businesses there. The Nazareth Inn was built in 1771 on the corner of South Main Street and Belvedere Street. Originally owned and operated by the church, it accommodated visitors to our growing area. In 1856, the church leaders ended the Moravian-only restrictions to building, living, and working in Nazareth. With that opening, many more important businesses moved into Nazareth, especially C.F. Martin and Company. C.F. Martin Jr. bought the whole block of land at North Main and North Streets for a workshop and his home. In 1859, the now world-famous Martin Guitar Company moved into Nazareth. Nazareth opened to non-Moravians in 1856 and has continued to grow in people, neighborhoods, churches, and businesses. We truly have been blessed since our 1740 founding. Now, our story continues. Thank you for allowing me to share the story of the Moravians, the story of Nazareth, and my story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will enjoy our favorite Moravian hymn, Sing Hallelujah, Praise the Lord.